Hello, class, and welcome to our second module, Race, Ethnicity, and Schools. For this module, we will be moving into understanding the social construction of race, thinking about more clearly the definition of ethnicity. Oftentimes, individuals use race and ethnicity as if they are one and the same, and they are not. So we'll talk about the definitions of ethnicity, as well as how we have come to make sense of our own ethnicities. We will describe how educational practices are in place to either support or eliminate some of the ethnic differences that we see among students in our schools. We will analyze the impact that the nation has seen in the growing racial diversity that we have currently, more specifically as we're attending to what's happening in our public school spaces. We will define and learn about oppression, power, and privilege. We will think about strategies for what it means to truly affirm race and ethnicity in our school spaces, as well as in our society. And then we will work towards a shared understanding of anti-racism and what anti-racist pedagogical strategies are. So those will be our learning outcomes as we work through this module. And this will be your lecture that will give you some foundational understanding as you move through your assignments, as well as the supplemental resources that you will find over this week and the next. So as we think about an introduction to understanding race and how we have come to learn about race, it's important for us to think about its origins and its the ways in which it has been socially constructed within the United States in particular. We know that as we're attending to the idea of race, it is something that is socially constructed. And what that means is that it has been created over time based off of historical realities that have been put in place to attempt to sustain some level of difference by these forms of definition. If we're attending to what has happened in the United States, we know that the U.S. economy was historically based in the enslavement of African people, and the displacement and genocide of indigenous North American people. And in that, we can start our understanding, and hopefully this is following your review and engagement in the deculturalization project. So you have some insights into the ways in which different minoritized groups have experienced this social construction of race in the US as I'm talking about this. But you can begin to start to think about how we can see that social construction piece that is connected to how we see race in the US. We know that our president, Thomas Jefferson, really enforced the idea. There's data and readings that are dated back to the ways in which he enforced the natural differences, the idea that there were natural differences that existed between different people, and really pushed towards this idea that there needed to be some way to define those differences in the context of race, and in the creation of what was termed race science. So this science that was created, not grounded in true science, but was created to try to differentiate the ways in which certain people were characterized. We see the growth of the ways in which that race science has shaped historically how we even experience our realities even in present day. These studies that we know that stemmed from the origins of race science, which also guided quite a bit of the political interest in that time, really reinforced, not based on scientific facts, as I reinforce, again, there was no biological foundation for this race science, the ways in which societal implications shaped how we engaged with each other, how we made sense of who other people were, and how we came to understand and experience difference. I listed a couple of dates here just to give us some more data points and insight into thinking about how we saw some of this progression historically as we're attending to social construction, the historical positioning of the social construction of race. We know that the term white to differentiate from non-white. We see represented in colonial law dating all the way back to the 1600s. We know that in around the 1790s, you will see some documentation and some pieces in the historical claims where there is race as a part of the census, right? The ways in which people made sense of who they are. So it went from something that was embedded in race science that ultimately spilled into just societal implications for how people made sense of who they were. We know that in 1825, there was some claims for measurements around how to classify who was deemed either white or non-white. And we see that difference really threaded throughout the ways in which we see minoritized identities experiencing their realities. Again, reflecting back on your deculturalization projects and the things that you learn, not only in your own chapter, but also in the chapters with your classmates. And then we know in the late 1800s, really through the 20th century, we have a huge wave of immigrants that enter the US. And whiteness as a thing becomes more concrete in the ways in which we engage, in the ways in which society functions, in the ways in which we make sense of systems, structures, institutions. And so I give you this overview because this will really be threaded throughout this module, and is really foundational in thinking about understanding experience as we're tending to race and ethnicity. So thinking about ethnicity and race even further, in particular, giving us more insights into ethnicity, we know, as I suggested, with the huge waves of folks that came, that immigrated to the U.S. Over time, and that continue to come to the U.S., has created this space of a very ethnically and racially diverse nation. We have over 300 different ethnicities represented within the US, and these are the ways in which people have chosen to identify themselves with their national origins from their ancestors. So if we haven't gotten from the social construction of race introductory page, we should now know at this point that race is a social construct, okay? It's something that was created to differentiate amongst different people. Realistically, what is happening as we're attending to this, and we've had to embrace it because it's historically ingrained in the ways in which we make sense of a lot of things, right? Thinking about the census, thinking about the ways in which we define things on certain applications. It's a part of how we function in our society, but it is socially constructed because it was based off of race science, which had no biological foundation. And realistically, as we're attending to ethnicity, we're talking about the connection of an individual to their national origins of their ancestors. So some of the most basic definition of thinking about ethnicity is thinking about the native country where someone identifies or connects with in connection to their ancestors. The character of an ethnic group is something that can shift and change over time, attending to native country and certain aspects of origin that come with that, right? And they are also connected to cultural ways in which we connect and make sense of who we are in connection to that country of origin. We know that those that are born in the US oftentimes belong to one or more different ethnic groups. And that as we're thinking about ethnicity, there's often a common bond within a particular ethnic group that is sustained and developed through family, through friends, through neighbors, that ultimately kind of develop out these intimate characteristics of living that are shared within those respective ethnicities. So in thinking about ethnicity, it's important that as we're attending to ethnic groups, we know that that particular ethnic group or the ways in which individuals align themselves with their ethnicity means that they're suggesting that they have a shared cultural heritage with individuals that either have a similar national origin as they do, or if you have multiple ethnic groups that you identify with, there's a cultural heritage that might be threaded through how you're defining that component of ethnicity. And so what does that mean as we pull it or scale it down a bit in thinking about ethnic identity? I really want to even just take a moment here for you to think about your own ethnicity. If someone was to ask you, what was your ethnicity, what would be your response? For some of you, as I'm sharing this, you might feel as if you've never thought about your ethnicity before or your ethnic identity. For some of you, it might be extremely salient in who you are and how you show up and how you define yourself. That is me. I am very clear in how I define my ethnic identity. But it's very important to note the spectrum of response as we are in this moment thinking about what it means to think about ethnic identity, and how for some it might be more salient and for others it might not be. That'll be something that I will continue to revisit as we work through not only this module but other modules, as we're tending to components of individuals' identities that are important to them in different ways. Particularly also attending to your circles of your multicultural self activity, where you had to think about 4 components of self that were most important, and thinking about whether or not ethnicity or even your race, if you choose to think about it in that context, showed up in one of those 4 bubbles, and how it does for some and it doesn't for others, right? Very important point to note as we learn in this course together. We know that ethnic identity is influenced very early on in life, as I suggested on the previous slide, by family members, friends, community members. And it's often those family members and friends that promote the importance of ethnicity as an important part of their identity. So if an individual has a very salient connection to their ethnicity, it's oftentimes because within their family dynamic, it's been promoted as a very important part of who they are and how they're making sense of how they navigate in and out of social spaces, right? Sometimes the choice is imposed, particularly as we're tending to groups that are oppressed ethnic groups, that we'll talk about oppression a little bit later and what that might mean. It's imposed to ensure that those individuals feel a strong kind of loyal ethnic identity in a space where they might not often receive that type of affirmation otherwise. And sometimes it's not, because and if you're thinking about being connected to a particular privileged ethnic group where you don't have to necessarily fight as much to feel seen in particular spaces, it might not be a part of your identity that is the most salient, right? Or there might not necessarily need to be such a systematic maintenance of group solidarity because you're a part of a majority group in the spaces that you work in and out of. So when you're thinking about group solidarity, that is oftentimes in spaces where there's not much representation. And so there's such a need to connect because you are oftentimes excluded or alone in social spaces that you move throughout. In these cases, we know that when there is the maintenance of group solidarity, or there is kind of the reinforced and imposed connection to a person's ethnic identity because they might be connected to an oppressed ethnic group, oftentimes in those situations, that becomes the primary factor of identification. And that's important also to know as we're attending to how our students and how we even show up in certain spaces. We also know that as we're attending to ethnic identity, that in developing a healthy and secure ethnic identity, we know that there's growth and an increase in overall sense of self and identity, sense of belonging, sense of optimism, and self-esteem. We know that the scholarship and the research suggests that in that kind of strong understanding of an ethnic identity, we see those bullet points of growth for students. To young children, we also know that ethnic awareness increases with age. And children start to think about differences very early on. This is actually something that becomes surprising to a lot of people, that children, even by the age of 4, are very much aware of the differences in appearance and language and the names of their classmates, right? And then very soon after the age of 4, there's an even more heightened awareness around religious identities, right? And cultural distinctions connected to that. And so oftentimes as parents, as teachers, as key stakeholders in educational spaces, we don't think that we don't engage young children in conversations around race and ethnicity because we think maybe they might not be prepared. But the reality is that they become aware very early on, and it shows again in the scholarship that the more that they have a healthy and secure understanding of these components of self, we know that there's optimism, there's heightened self-esteem, there's a heightened sense of belonging or making sense of what it means to feel included. So it's really important for us to think about and have an understanding of what this means. We know as we're thinking more deeply into ethnic identity, that as one thinks about how they align with a particular ethnic group and they're making sense of that ethnic identity and who they are, it often shapes how they think about particular things, how they perceive what their feelings, and how they align with certain aspects of behavior in certain spaces that are connected to that particular ethnic group's membership. So it's important to note that ethnic identity is separate from one's personal identity as an individual, okay? They're not oftentimes one and in the same. That's where we see bias, that's where we see stereotypes come into play, okay? But those two components of self may influence one another, okay? So very important to know as we're unpacking ethnic identity more. There are four major components of ethnic identity. There's ethnic awareness, which is centered around understanding your own ethnic identity and other groups. There's ethnic self-identification, so being able to understand the label associated with the ethnic identity that you are aligning with. There are ethnic attitudes. These are about the feelings that we might have about our own ethnic identity and the feelings that we have about someone else's ethnic identity. And then there's ethnic behaviors. And these are the behavior patterns that might be associated with a particular ethnic identity that we might ascribe to in the ways in which we function. And so this very multifaceted understanding of ethnic identity gives us the ways in which we can make sense of how people show up as they embrace this component of self. And it's really important, again, to note another point of difference, that there is something else which is considered culture and social identity, which is another aspect of how a person shows up, right? And if you haven't gotten already, you will get in this course throughout the modules that an individual's identity is extremely multifaceted and complex. And oftentimes, we diminish the ways in which our students show up in the complexity that they are. And we don't make space for them to connect to these different aspects of self. And so as we're attending to ethnic identity, and even as we move forward and learn more about culture and social identity, it's important to think about all of these different components of that make up these very complex pieces of self as we are thinking about ways to heighten our consciousness around how our students show up, particularly as we're attending to language preference, connections to ethnicities, age, gender, sexual orientation, class, generational connections, and so on, right? Very complex, very multifaceted. It's very important that we stay in tune and aware of all of these different ways that individuals show up in spaces. And maybe if we're not aware, right, maybe if we don't know, that we don't necessarily present an agenda that suggests that we feel like we do know. So that leaves the necessary space for learning more, right? Even as an instructor, as I teach this often, I don't ever allow myself to position my awareness or my quote unquote wokeness, as some folks use in today's language, that I know all things that is all people, right? And so I create the space to allow myself to learn from those that might come into my spheres of influence to teach me about who they are, right? That really is the ultimate approach, I think, in thinking about how we can embody and utilize this knowledge as we move forward. So what does that mean as we attend to the ways in which we know there is complexity in how people show up? There are different aspects of identity that we need to consider, or at least continue to allow ourselves to learn and understand. What does that mean, and why is it important? Well, it's important because, again, as we think back to our deculturalization projects, there are impacts of assimilation and acculturation that come from groups that are have components of ethnic identity and components of cultural and social identity. But as they've moved into certain spaces, they've been asked to either adapt, assimilate, or acculturate those components of self. We know that most immigrant families, and these are families that come from origins other than Europe. So when I'm utilizing the language of immigrant families, I'm talking about families with origins other than Europe, families who are not the dominant religious identity, which is Christian or conservative Christian, um, um, or even, let me take that back. Conservative Christian families also have some tensions around fighting acculturation. And we'll talk about that as we move into our religion and schools module, like what that means, how that shows up sometimes. But oftentimes in the ways in which we make sense of dominant identities, we know that there is such a desire or want, rather, to not feel forced to assimilate and to maintain your values, your beliefs, and your codes of behavior, because they're an important part of yourself, right? And as you read in the Joel Spring text, as we read about the deculturalization of minoritized peoples, whole communities and populations of people had their identities stripped, their values stripped, their beliefs stripped, right? Their behavior stripped, right? Because they didn't align with the dominant identity. They were not allowed to just show up in the space. And these are two very important words to note if you are not as familiar with them at this point in our semester together. Assimilation is when a person comes from a particular group's culture and is forced to resemble that of another group. Acculturation is the process of the social, the psychological, and cultural change that stems between the blend of multiple cultures, right? So and oftentimes you hear language like code switching, which is another term, which is very similar to acculturation. But this is where you have two components of self kind of working simultaneously, and there's a blend of something that emerges from that creates this kind of acculturated sense of self. So the native sense of origin of identity and the newly adopted culture kind of blend to create something else that becomes the new form of who someone is. And that degree of acculturation is something that can vary, right? How much of the host, the newly adopted culture is taken on versus how much of the native culture is sustained. And we will see different examples of that. And maybe we could even think two different examples of that in maybe the communities where we come from, where we know that there are communities of people that have adopted some components of dominant identity, but they still hold very fast to some of their native values, their native beliefs, their native forms of behavior, and they balance the two, right? They're able to maintain or hold fast to them simultaneously in the adaptation of what that means to acculturate in their identity. So you will see some of this even still present day. And now that you're familiarized with these terms, as you're reflecting on your own experiences in the communities that you come from, think about the ways in which you might see maybe some present day examples of assimilation and acculturation. And really what that takes us to, as we're thinking about the ways in which we see assimilation and acculturation in connection to the ways in which dominant identities have implications on how minoritized groups can show up in certain spaces, is this idea around the social construction of whiteness. And we know, as we think back to the very beginning of this talk, that we talked about race as something that is socially constructed. Being able to see the representation of the terminology of white, even written into some of colonial law and other forms of documentation that we know historically have shaped how we come to make sense of who is included and who is excluded in certain aspects of societal life, right? And it would be remiss of me not to bring to also the conversation the ways in which we make sense of race and its connection to whiteness, which is the dominant form of identity that shapes the ways in which many groups have had to assimilate or acculturate historically over time. We see that in our Joel Spring text that we've read. And so I oftentimes like to make sure that students have a good understanding of thinking about the ways in which we make sense of the social construction of whiteness so that we can better understand its implications as we continue to read in the course, as well as the ways in which we will continue to understand and unpack other aspects of identity. We know that whiteness or white racialized identity is referring to the ways that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as a standard in which all other groups have to compare. So the experiences of the Black community, the experience of the Latinx community, the experiences of the Native American or the indigenous population, the ways in which they've had to ascribe to a form of white racialized identity as the goal for how they should function, right? Historically, and even we can make sense of that even present day in the ways in which individuals navigate society. We know that this idea of whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. You can't unpack a lot of the racial issues and tensions that are not new, but we are in a state where more people are willing to engage and unpack what this might mean for the ways in which you've existed, right? That we also have to attend to whiteness. If we talk about the experiences of the Latinx population, we talk about the experiences of the Black community, we also need to attend to the white community too, right? What that means simultaneously. There are multiple facets of representation there, and we need to ensure that we attend to that. Oftentimes, as we attend to race in America, though, we do not attend to the experiences of whiteness and the social construction of whiteness and how that does connect to the ways in which minoritized people face a lot of the racist realities that they navigate, right? Very important to note. We know that whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity within American history has created a culture where the dominant identity or whiteness is seen as, or if you are not white, to some extent, there's an inferior status or an abnormal status that is associated with that. Now, for some of you, you might be very familiar with the social construction of whiteness. You might have even had some experiences in some other classes, which is great. For some of you, this might be very new to even hear me sharing some of these ways in which we think about the social construction of whiteness and what that means as we attend to race and ethnicity. But it's extremely important to think about this now, as we've gotten a historical kind of unpacking of the experiences of minoritized folks in the Joel Spring text, and how non-white persons were abnormal. Non-white persons were inferior. That is not something that sustained itself historically, though, in the past. That is something that is still a very real thing that we experience in present day, and it's important for us to fully understand if we seek to work in spaces, not only school spaces, because I do know some of my students in ed sciences do not desire to be a practicing teacher in the classroom, but you might still be connected in other ways, right? You might still be in social spaces where you're engaging with people that are very different from you. You might even be engaging in critical thought and understanding. And so having this kind of foundational knowledge is extremely important as you move forward.